Good morning. My name is Angela Poff. I'm a research associate here at the University of South Florida. I work in the Laboratory of Metabolic Medicine with Dr. Dominic D'Agostino here at USF. And our lab is interested in a variety of things, but we're very interested in studying the ways that we can non-toxically manipulate our metabolism to prevent or treat disease. Personally, I'm most interested in cancer research, so I've done a lot of work looking at different ways that we can understand cancer metabolism and potentially affect those metabolic pathways through diet or other non-toxic methods such as hyperbaric oxygen therapy. But our lab actually does a whole host of things. So we look at seizure disorders, which is a major interest of our lab, and other neurological conditions. So what I'm going to be speaking about this morning, though, is the what, why, and how of studying the ketogenic diet for cancer. So what are the aspects of cancer behavior and cancer metabolism that we are trying to target? Why do tumors behave like this in the first place? And how do we think that ketosis could potentially influence those behaviors or phenotypes of the cancer? So I do want to start off by saying I am a research scientist. I'm not a physician. So please consider that in the light of this conversation. The interest in ketogenic diet and ketosis as a potential cancer therapy is really young in the grand scheme of things. And so there's a lot of preclinical research ongoing right now, and we have a number of clinical trials going on, but this is not something that has been proven in clinical trials. So it's really important, if you are interested in this from a personal perspective or from a medical perspective, anything that you do, definitely work closely with your oncologist and have them approve and supervise anything that you choose to do. But what I want to talk about is really the science behind it, kind of down to the nitty-gritty behind mechanisms of why we think this might actually be something promising enough to spend a lot of time researching. So let's see, I've got some notes over here on the side so I don't lose track. So first, what? So what we're trying to target with cancer is this metabolic phenotype. So probably most of you, if you're interested in this field, especially cancer specifically, you've kind of heard talk about this different kind of metabolism that tumors seem to exhibit. We call this the Warburg Effect. This is one aspect of cancer metabolism that is of interest. And the Warburg Effect really refers to this kind of abnormal situation where tumors will preferentially, even in the presence of oxygen, utilize highly these glycolytic and fermentation metabolic pathways. So when we consume energy metabolites like glucose, they get taken up into the cells. They go through a variety of metabolic pathways that get turned into energy. It is abnormal for most of our healthy cells to choose to ferment that pathway unless they have to. So usually oxygen is kind of the limiting step in that process. If oxygen is not available, then our cells will choose to undergo fermentation. But most healthy cells don't do this normally as a means to make most of their energy. But this is actually what the Warburg Effect is. So tumors seem to quite often, and this varies between cancer types and varies between early stage cancers and late stage cancers as well, the degree to which this occurs. But we do very consistently see this Warburg phenotype where the tumors are taking in lots of glucose and shipping them through the fermentative pathways instead of shipping it all the way into the mitochondria to make energy that way. So that's what the Warburg Effect is. So why do tumors do this? This is actually a topic of great discussion and interest in the cancer metabolism community and with cancer researchers currently. It's something that has been studied for a very long time. There's lots of proposed explanations for why tumors are utilizing these pathways in the way that they do. But there's a few that are really what I think the most promising. So in fact, it seems a little bit odd that tumors would choose to preferentially use the fermentative pathway to make energy. If you remember back to your biochemistry days when we learned that fermentation to make energy is a really inefficient way to make energy. So you only make a couple of ATP per glucose molecule that gets consumed. Whereas if you were to instead fully utilize those mitochondrial metabolism pathways, you could make a lot more energy. But energy is only half the story. So if you think about a growing tumor, that tumor has to not only have energy to provide, the fuel to run all these new pathways, but it also needs new building blocks for the tumor. Meaning the tumor has to grow new lipids and DNA and proteins in order to actually grow new tumor cells and tissue. So that's kind of both sides of the coin need to really be fulfilled to allow this unbridled growth that is characteristic of tumors. And the Warburg metabolism, the Warburg effect, really bestows many benefits onto the tumor to help satisfy those conditions. So while you're not making as much energy through the energy pathways of the Warburg metabolism, in fact, you're actually being able to, instead of completely oxidizing those glucose molecules all the way through the mitochondria, where we would end up breathing off all of those carbons of glucose as CO2, instead of doing that, we can make a little bit of energy in those more primitive pathways of fermentation, and then take those glucose carbons and ship them towards new biomass synthesis. So what that means is we're taking those glucose carbons and now we're making new protein, new lipids to form the new cell membranes, new DNA so that the tumor can grow. So many research scientists in the field think that a primary reason this is a really common feature of tumors is that, in fact, this is an adaptive phenotype of tumors. Tumor realizes, for lack of a better word, that there's actually a lot of benefit to adapting this metabolic scenario. And, it is true that in many proliferating tissues, we actually see the similar kind of metabolic phenotype, such that if a tissue is proliferating rapidly, you see more of a glycolytic phenotype than an oxidative phenotype. So when we look at the Warburg effect, we see there's actually a lot of benefits that it bestows onto the tumor, which really makes it a very good therapeutic target, because if this type of metabolism is being used preferentially by the tumor in order to support this rapid, unbridled growth, then we can understand that if we can block that metabolic phenotype at different ways, then maybe we could actually, reduce some of those benefits that the tumor was experiencing. Now, there's also suggestions that this Warburg effect is also possibly, in some cancers, downstream of metabolic dysfunction, such that rather than the tumor simply choosing to perform Warburg metabolism because it is beneficial to the tumor, in fact, maybe to some degree it's having to do this because the mitochondria are damaged. And this is what some individuals call the metabolic theory of cancer, and there certainly is a lot of evidence to support that mitochondrial function, morphology, structure is often very abnormal in tumors. And possibly this is one reason that the Warburg effect also happens. So regardless of why we think the Warburg effect is occurring in tumors, everyone pretty much agrees that it seems to be present to some degree in probably most tumors, which again makes it a really good therapeutic target. So this is something that we can try to target and possibly could be beneficial as a therapeutic target for many different cancer types. And that's one big reason we're interested in trying to target this phenotype. So let's see. So we talked about why tumors have this abnormal metabolism, but why do we think that ketosis could impact it? Well, a lot of you guys are probably very familiar, if you're following Adapt Your Life, you're probably very familiar with the idea of the ketogenic diet, and you kind of know what the metabolic changes are that occur in your body when someone starts consuming a ketogenic diet. So if I were to ask you, you would probably say glucose lowers, right? Well, that's true. So typically we see that there's a modest lowering of our baseline glucose levels when someone is consuming a ketogenic diet. Now remember, the metabolism of tumors, that Warburg effect, accentuates these glycolytic and fermentative pathways. And glucose is that substrate that feeds into those pathways. So right off the bat, this is a pretty obvious reason to start suggesting, well, maybe we should at least study that the ketogenic diet might impact tumors, simply by reducing the availability of the primary substrate for this metabolic phenotype. And that is exactly what researchers suggested early on could be a good reason to study the ketogenic diet for. And in fact, we do see there is clinical data and preclinical data that suggests under the context of a ketogenic diet, tumors take up less glucose. Now, a lot of people will say, is it really going to impact a tumor that much? You have a small decrease really in the basal glucose. It's not like our glucose levels actually plummet. Sometimes people, when they're speaking casually, kind of throw out this idea that like the ketogenic diet starves cancer of glucose, and that's not really accurate if we think about it in the sense that our glucose levels still maintain a relatively normal state, but they are slightly reduced. But think about what's happening when you eliminate carbohydrate heavy meals. You actually are eliminating this postprandial spike in glucose that is occurring multiple times a day, or including if you think about snacks, carbohydrate snacks and meals, that could be really quite often you have these major spikes in the glucose levels. Now that potentially could impact the tumor as well. So not just a basal reduction in the amount of glucose that is available to the tumor, but actually elimination of those postprandial spikes. Now, everything I said about glucose is pretty much true for insulin as well. So insulin is a growth factor, and it's a very potent growth factor that is very important for many cancers. So a lot of tumors will have upregulated insulin receptors on their cell membranes. Same for insulin-like growth factor receptors, IGF receptors. And we see overactivation of the insulin PI3 kinase AKT signaling pathway inside the cancer cells. And that pathway will help promote the cell's proliferation, which means promote the cell's ability to divide, to make new cancer cells, and also kind of stop responding to these signals that tell it to induce apoptosis or cell death. So insulin, again, is another aspect of why a ketogenic diet could potentially be useful as a treatment modality for cancer, because many tumors thrive on excess insulin signaling. And because we know on a ketogenic diet that insulin is also reduced and we're eliminating the macronutrient that most spikes our insulin, again, this is another theoretical reason why possibly tumors may be targeted by a ketogenic diet. So lactate production is another aspect of ketogenic therapies that may explain why in preclinical models at least we do see some therapeutic benefit to a ketogenic diet. So remember I said that glycolytic fermentative metabolism is often very important for tumors. And what the end product of that is lactate. Lactate is an acid, and it gets shipped out of the cancer cell into the tumor microenvironment. And it acts there to decrease the pH of the tumor microenvironment and actually promote the aggressive phenotype of the tumor. So lactate is known to really contribute to the aggressive capacity of the tumor, specifically its ability to invade the local tissue around the tumor and potentially access the vasculature in order to metastasize and form a tumor somewhere else in the body. So again, a ketogenic diet is reducing the flux through this glycolytic fermentative pathways such that maybe less lactate is being produced and less lactate is then actually getting out into the tumor microenvironment. Another aspect of this is a decrease in inflammation. So we've known for a long time that the metabolic state of ketosis is associated with a reduction in inflammation. And within the past few years, we've actually began to uncover a lot more of the mechanistic explanations for why that may be happening. Part of it is almost certainly a reduction in glucose. So hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia is often quite inflammatory and associated with chronic elevation of inflammation. But actually the ketones themselves could be playing an important role in this story too. So the major ketone, beta-hydroxybutyrate, was described just a few years ago as an histone deacetylase inhibitor, HDAC inhibitor. This actually is an aspect of tumor metabolism signaling where you can actually influence the gene expression of the tumor. So that is going to be impacting gene expression. And there's actually a large variety of genes that influence inflammation and also oxidative stress, which is very tightly related to inflammation in the tumor. So we know that ketones and the primary ketone, beta-hydroxybutyrate, can actually impact those effects in the tumor on a signaling level. So the primary way, though, that beta-hydroxybutyrate seems to impact inflammation on a signaling level that we currently know of is its impact on something called the inflammasome. So the NLRP3 inflammasome is a component of the innate immune system that actually gets activated in chronic diseases associated with inflammation, but also within the tumor microenvironment, and it incites inflammation. So it was described a few years ago that beta-hydroxybutyrate can actually inhibit the assembly of the inflammasome and therefore may explain why we see a reduction in inflammation associated with a metabolic state of ketosis. So I got a little bit ahead of myself a second ago because my next point was going to be that potentially ketones and ketosis could also influence gene expression. So I mentioned that beta-hydroxybutyrate can function as an endogenous histone deacetylase inhibitor. So HDAC inhibitors are actually a class of anti-cancer drugs, and so there are synthetic ones on the market and currently being utilized in various cancers. And it's because of their ability to basically reopen up expression of certain tumor suppressor genes within the tumor in a way that would basically put some brakes on the tumor's growth and survival. So here we see the primary metabolite that gets elevated in response to a ketogenic lifestyle, beta-hydroxybutyrate, will actually be able to influence gene expression. Now, there's not really been much research specifically in tumors themselves looking at the ability of BHB to influence gene expression through this mechanism, but there is some work that shows that under the context of a ketogenic diet, the gene expression profile of the tumor changes. Dr. Adrienne Scheck, who's a dear friend and colleague of ours here at USF, she is based out in Phoenix Children's Hospital, I believe. She has done some really incredible work showing that when you look at the gene expression of a tumor from an animal that was fed a ketogenic diet, it actually looks a little bit more like healthy tissue than tumorous tissue. So suggesting that the diet is somehow affecting the gene's expression. So that was something that she had shown a few years ago. And now we know that ketones themselves can influence gene expression. So again, this is where we're seeing some of these pockets of data come out that have not necessarily been proven to be directly causative or explain what we're seeing, but are suggestive and supportive of this idea that ketosis may be a potential therapy for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that some of the studies looking at the effects of BHB as an HDAC inhibitor actually showed that many of the targeted genes that were influenced by BHB actually were related to antioxidant capacity. So the study showed that endogenous antioxidant genes like catalase, superoxide dismutase were actually upregulated in response to BHB signaling. And again, this was not within the context of a tumor. But when we take that information and we think about what that could mean, it could mean that we have some kind of impact on the oxidative stress of the tumor. And this is actually another theoretical reason as to why ketosis could be beneficial. So it's really complicated, so I won't really get into it too much, but essentially oxidative stress plays a really important role in tumors. Elevated levels actually promote the tumor's growth and progressive capacity, but it also is used to overproduce oxidative stress in response to things like radiation therapy. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword for tumors. So it's very complicated, but we know that ketosis has the potential to impact the oxidative stress level within the tumor. And because the vast majority of the preclinical research currently suggests that often ketogenic diets have an inhibitory effect on tumor growth, we think that this is another promising avenue to at least explore and see maybe if this is impacting in certain cancers the therapeutic response. Let's see. So another potential mechanism is actually by enhancing anti-tumor immunity. So our immune system has a normal potential and capability to actually suppress tumor origination and tumor growth. And when the immune system kind of loses control on that system is when the tumor can actually evade the immune system and grow into a cancerous lesion. So there's a lot of research right now in immunotherapies for cancer, trying to develop ways to basically aid our own immune system's capacity to fight the tumor. Now, another really incredible piece of work from Dr. Sheck a few years ago was showing that in the context of a mouse glioma model, so a mouse brain tumor model, these animals that were put on a ketogenic diet basically had improved anti-tumor immunity. So we saw that basically the immune system cells were better able to detect and attack the tumor, and the tumor wasn't quite as capable at suppressing the immune system's response onto the tumor. And so in that model, it actually seemed that this was a really important part of the story, because when you knocked out that capacity, you didn't see the same level of therapeutic effect of the ketogenic diet. Another potential mechanism that people are studying is not necessarily impact on tumor directly or tumor growth, but actually the impact on the whole physiology. So ketosis is known to be a muscle sparing effect. So evolutionarily, it was really important for us to be able to access our stored body fat, because that's where we keep most of our calories, and make these water-soluble ketone molecules that can cross the blood-brain barrier to feed the brain during starvation. Because if the brain was required to rely on glucose, we don't have a whole lot stored in our body. We have glycogen, maybe a couple days worth possibly of glycogen available that could be used to fuel the brain if it had to have glucose only. And then we would have to start really breaking down our muscle. So you guys probably know about half of our protein can be converted into glucose. So if we didn't have this capability of making ketones to fuel the brain during starvation, we would have to break down our muscle protein, and that would be very negative. Even in the short term, even within a couple of weeks, you could probably see cardiorespiratory muscle failure in response. But thankfully, we are able to convert our stored fat into ketones, which then fuels the brain in those situations. So probably because of this evolutionary adaptation to utilizing ketones in a catabolic state, so in a situation where we need to stop breaking down muscle, there are now some evidence that suggests that ketosis itself may actually prevent this. So ketones, maybe even a signaling mechanism, could potentially prevent muscle breakdown, or possibly, again, in a catabolic state, actually promote muscle synthesis. So this is relevant to cancer because, as you guys are probably aware, in late-stage cancer patients, patients with terminal degrees, metastatic tumors, you often see cachexia. So this is a wasting of muscle and fat. Muscle is really the most important thing that we're worried about. In these patients, cachexia is very prevalent. I think up to 80% of advanced cancer patients actually exhibit cachexia, and it is a direct contributor to morbidity and mortality in these patients. So it's interesting that ketosis could actually even have a beneficial impact on the metabolic or the whole system physiology to preserve muscle mass